Have you ever wondered what happens if the creators of SpongeBob SquarePants got rid of Gary the Snail? The creators made a test episode called Goodbye Gary, an episode not supposed to be released to the public. My dad works at Nickelodeon Studios, and mainly worked on SpongeBob and the Loud House, but sometimes worked on other shows. Goodbye Gary was a darker than the usual SpongeBob standards. Since my dad worked at Nickelodeon Studios, he would sometimes bring home DVDs of the newer episodes, and some that were test episodes so that he could edit them, to see if there were any errors in the episode, or to change anything that seemed wrong. When he got home, he put a DVD on the kitchen counter and told me that he was running out for a while. He never mentioned the DVD, mostly because it looked like he was in a hurry. After he left, I grabbed the DVD off the counter, put it in my DVD player, and then sat on my chair in my room to watch the episode. I was not ready for what I was about to watch. The episode started out with a title card with a pet bowl with the name Gary, and above it read Goodbye, which read out Goodbye Gary. Sad violin music was playing in the background. The beginning credits rolled normally, and it went to a shot of a pet hospital. The camera zoomed into the hospital, and it goes to a shot of SpongeBob sitting in what looked like some kind of waiting room. He had bags under his eyes and looked completely nervous. The episode then went into a flashback scene, and it showed SpongeBob watching TV in his living room. A loud noise was heard from the kitchen. He got up and walked into it, and he gasped and ran to the source of the noise. It was Gary, with foam coming out of his mouth. He was having a seizure. He looked over to where he found Gary and saw the bowl upside down, with brown snail food all over the kitchen floor. The last part of the flashback scene was SpongeBob running out of his pineapple house, Gary in his arms. The camera then goes back to the waiting room, with SpongeBob still sitting with bags under with a nervous expression. A fish in a doctor's coat comes out to walks to SpongeBob. "Is Gary all right, Doctor?" SpongeBob says, trying not to stutter. The snail food that he ingested had rat poison inside of it. He ate too much of it and died. "I'm sorry, SpongeBob," the doctor said in a depressed voice, putting a fin on SpongeBob's shoulders. SpongeBob began to yell, "No!" so loud that it almost made me go deaf. While this happened, the camera panned out of the hospital. The screen faded to black. The screen then came back to SpongeBob sitting in his house, with Sandy and Patrick with a couple of Krabby Patties. But something was different about SpongeBob. His skin was darker, like it was fading. "Hey Sandy," Patrick began, "do you think SpongeBob looks different?" "He lost Gary," Sandy said. "Give him some time. Here, SpongeBob." She gave SpongeBob a Krabby Patty. "This'll sure cheer you up, for sure." As Sandy put the Krabby Patty in SpongeBob's hand, it switched to SpongeBob's perspective and showed the patty in his hand. It slowly morphed into a small Gary. "Meow," the Gary in SpongeBob's imagination said. It switched out of SpongeBob's perspective. Tears started dripping from his eyes as he said, "Oh, Gary, I'm so sorry. I wish you didn't get poisoned." As he was saying this, Sandy and Patrick tried to tell him to be quiet, but they failed miserably. Squidward burst through the door and screamed, "Will you cut it out?" SpongeBob then went silent. Patrick got up and yelled at Squidward, "Do you have any idea what happened? Gary died last week. SpongeBob is sad about it, and you come here to silence him? This was very unlike Patrick's character. Squidward came back at Patrick, yelling at him, saying, "Gary died? Why couldn't it have been SpongeBob who died? This would have been a lot calmer, and I would be happier than I am now. Or why couldn't it have been you who died, Patrick? We've had enough retards in Bikini Bottom alone." That line was very dark, especially for Squidward. They never said retard in this show before. And after that said, SpongeBob got up from his chair. This is where it went downhill fast. "If you don't get out of my house right now, Squidward, I'm going to kill you," SpongeBob screamed at Squidward, acting completely serious. Squidward didn't seem fazed at him. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it? Hit me with your tears?" Squidward said, laughing after he said that. SpongeBob finally got triggered. SpongeBob started running angrily towards Squidward, leapt up into the air, and jumped onto him. He started punching Squidward in the face, clawing at him. Sandy and Patrick tried to get SpongeBob off of him, but he just kept attacking him, pushing the two away while they tried to pull him off. Sandy threw a rolling pin at SpongeBob, knocking him off of Squidward. When SpongeBob got punched, a realistic punch sound effect played. Squidward had a bruised nose, scratch marks all over his body, pieces of his shirt torn off, and a black eye. Squidward then yelled, "Get away from me, you psychotic sponge!" And he ran out of the pineapple house. He ran into his own house and boarded the entire building up. After this was over, SpongeBob then ran upstairs in his room while panting with anger, and slammed the door shut. Sandy and Patrick ran upstairs, and Sandy told him to open the door. SpongeBob then said, "No, I'm going to stay in my room forever." Sandy just told Patrick, "We should probably leave." He agreed, and they left. A time card appeared saying, 2 weeks later, and then it transitioned to Sandy and Squidward in front of SpongeBob's house. Squidward's nose was finally healed from the bruising, but it still had some injuries on his body. "You think SpongeBob will be okay with me being here, Sandy?" Squidward said in a calm voice. "Yeah, Squidward. He's probably over it by now. Maybe he's not so worked up like last time," Sandy said. "But he hasn't been to work in 3 weeks. I'm not sure about this, Sandy," he said. Sandy knocked on the door, but it slowly cracked open. The living room was dark, with the only light being the static of the television screen. "SpongeBob?" Squidward yelled. No response. "Hey, SquarePants, you still here?" Sandy yelled. Still no response. "He's probably still asleep," said Squidward. "At 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday," Sandy said. They decided to go upstairs to see if he was in his room. "Hey, SquarePants, are you in here?" Sandy said. Once again, no response. Squidward knocked on the door. No response again. "Open the door, Squidward," Sandy said. Squidward did as he said. When he opened the door, he gasped and froze. "What is it, Squidward?" Sandy said, very confused. Squidward started stuttering, but finally got the word out. "SpongeBob!" Sandy looked into the room and screamed, "Oh my God! SpongeBob!" The camera panned to a shot of SpongeBob lying dead on his bed with a butcher knife in his forehead. He was bleeding hyper-realistic blood from where he got stabbed in. There was a final shot of the episode as the credits rolled. I was in shock. I didn't know what to think that was. Was this supposed to be an actual episode? I had no idea what to say. I took the DVD out of the player and put it back in where it was before. My dad never found out that I watched the DVD. I believe that the SpongeBob episode is an alternate version of the currently running episode, Gary Come Home. And that, my little shadows, was Goodbye Gary, a SpongeBob SquarePants Lost Episode creepypasta. My final thoughts on the story? It certainly has been a little bit since I've actually narrated the story, but I think it's probably appropriate now that I give it a full-on review. And of course, like with most of these reviews, I'm going to start off by saying, actually reading the author's note. There is an author's note at the end of this, and I'm going to read it word for word. "Hello, this is Joey, the creator of the creepypasta. I don't think that my pasta is the best one in the entire ocean of pastas, and for sure it probably has some cliches in it that I might have missed. I tried my best with writing this, trying to make a concept that seemed pretty cliche into something that's at least a bit original. There might be some errors that I might have missed in the story as well. This story will probably get some hate. I just hope people will like it. If there are any questions that people would like to ask me, there's also a link to this person's Instagram. I just hope I can at least get some recognition for the story. Thank you for having time to read this. I really appreciate it. Thumbs up to you. Edit, January 28, 2018. Wow. Man, wow, it's been literally 2018? My God. Wow, I'm surprised that it doesn't have as much recognition as I was hoping for. This is one of my better, if not my best story I've ever written. Anyway, if you have any comments, just post them. I'm not going to stop you. And then there's a mentioning of grammar and other things being dealt with. Now, I'm taking a look at the story, and there doesn't seem to be any comments on here, which is kind of a surprise. But even then, let's actually get more or less to the actual storyline itself. Oh wait, I'm wrong. There's at least 5 of them, but I'll read them after this. Let's start off with the introduction of the story itself. Now, the startup paragraph of the story, or in this case, the startup sentence, sort of speak, for the most part is actually, it's somewhat okay. And the reason I say somewhat, mostly because of the fact that, okay, when it comes to any kind of startup paragraph, or in this case your topic sentence or your topic paragraph, or whatever it may seem to be, there always has to be something that more or less hooks you into that. Now, reading the first start of the introduction itself, it doesn't exactly seem to really be much of a hook. It's not a bad startup, more or less, and it definitely does seem a little bit interesting, but the idea of like saying, have you ever wondered what happens if the creators of SpongeBob SquarePants got rid of Gary the Snail? It is a question, but it's not really something that can honestly hook anybody into it. And reading it and everything, it was like, oh, well, that's a little bit of a disappointment, so to speak. And of course, then it goes on to say the creators made a test episode of Goodbye Gary, an episode that was not meant to be released to the public. Already, this was like literally less than 2 sentences, but it still didn't really provide a good startup with the story, which to me is a disappointment. Now, getting onto the second part of the paragraph itself, it basically goes into the explanation about, the father of the protagonist working at Nickelodeon Studios, and then mentioning a couple of other things, but also bringing home DVDs of newer episodes, and, and test episodes, and then watching them, editing them, and things like that. Now, I don't really know how true this is for a lot of people. I mean, I know I use that with my little reboot series that I do, but overall, though, I don't know how exactly true it is that people, bring this stuff home to work with. It's likely that might actually be the case, and if anybody can confirm or deny this, I would definitely really appreciate it in the comments section below. But, the whole thing, more or less, isn't anything that likely isn't that out of the ordinary about somebody working for a studio and then bringing something home, bringing something in to work on. More or less, it's an alright startup, so to speak. It's a good, kind of startup. And, the idea of somebody, the protagonist taking the DVD and beginning to watch it. And then it gets to the point, I was not ready for what I was about to watch. I understand that it's like a way to try and more or less transition, which is it's good. It's okay. It's an okay transition from the main beginning startup to the actual episode itself. It's not a bad one. And it definitely could have been a lot worse in retrospect, like, I will never watch SpongeBob ever again, or things like that. So this one actually did a relatively fair startup with it. However, there definitely could have been at least another sentence or so to kind of add a little bit more to it, to really help wrap everything up properly, instead of just being something that, at least in my own opinion, just quickly wraps it instead of carefully wrapping it up. Now, we're actually going to get into the episode itself. The descriptions of the episode, more or less, in the first startup of it, is not exactly as amazing as I thought it would be, and it's definitely not exactly how I really remember it entirely, mostly because of the fact that there's not really a huge shot of there's not really a whole lot of detail with the very beginning startup of the episode. It just says that there was a shot of a pet hospital, and then the camera zooms into the hospital, then goes to a shot of SpongeBob sitting in what looked like a waiting room, had bags under his eyes. There's a little bit of a problem with that. And the main issue I have is that there's not really too much of a good description. I mean, sure enough, I could somewhat visualize the whole thing, but that's mostly having to use most of my imagination. Whenever you're starting up an actual storyline itself, you always want to have a decent amount of detail put into the story itself. Now, you don't want unnecessary detail. You don't have to sit there and mention, like, the flowers were blue or things like that, but there definitely has to be a good startup, a good description setting, more or less, that kind of puts the reader in that specific position itself. Only just having, sad violin music playing in the background, pause, beginning credits plural, and then goes to a shot of a pet hospital, it kind of more or less has there has to be a better description to that. Maybe like a shot of, a little bit more of a better description maybe of where it probably was at, where at Bikini Bottom, or, even if something simple but with, better descriptions more or less. And, the whole thing with the camera zooming in on the hospital and then goes to a shot of SpongeBob sitting in what looked like a waiting room. Well, why not sit there and describe it a little bit better? Now, another thing too as well is that SpongeBob's description at the very end of this first paragraph of the episode, it just says that he has bags under his eyes and looks nervous. What would have been better to honestly help improve a lot more with the actual story concept, with the actual description, would be giving a little bit more of a better detailed thing with SpongeBob. Like, instead of just having, like, say, he had bags under his eyes and looked nervous, maybe something along the lines of, he was sitting down in his chair, looking rather nervous, and then going into more detail about, him looking as though he probably hadn't cleaned himself up in a few days, looked extremely nervous, looked sleep-deprived, basic, those kind of things that can actually more or less craft a good idea of what SpongeBob's honestly looking at. I mean, it doesn't exactly say that he looks sad or... I mean, it does mention that he does look nervous, but the only image that I'm getting is just a regular SpongeBob with a couple of bags under his eyes looking a little bit nervous. There definitely could have been a little bit more of a better description, more or less, put into it. That way the readers and everything can understand, or at least get a better visual of what SpongeBob, is looking like, and in a sense, really trying to showcase the severity of the situation, which really could have helped. Now, getting on to the second paragraph of this episode, which is specifically discussing the actual flashback scene, or the backstory, more or less, of why SpongeBob is there. Now, reading it and everything, it wasn't exactly it was very simplistic. It's not bad that it's simplistic, but it's just too simplistic. It basically just goes, a loud noise was heard in the kitchen, he got up, SpongeBob walking into the kitchen, seeing Gary foaming from the mouth, having a seizure, or, then again, I don't know whether or not if you really foam from the mouth if you are having a seizure, but still, looking where he found Gary, saw the bowl upside down. This is where there's an issue with this. It's not going into proper detail. It's just more or less... It has a lot of periods to it where there really shouldn't be periods. For example, a loud noise was heard in the kitchen. Period. He got up and walked into the kitchen. Period. He gasped and ran to the source of the noise. Period. That's a problem. There cannot be all these periods. It doesn't help the story at all. If you're going to do something like this, you have to at least add something else more to it. Like, a good example of it. I'm gonna be using a lot of examples to really kind of help explain, what could have been done to better the story. But seriously, all these periods were completely and utterly unnecessary in a lot of ways. And it takes away from the description, more or less, of the actual, it takes away from the story a bit. I mean, something that would have worked out was, SpongeBob, a loud noise was heard from the kitchen that came with the sounds of Gary's groans and a little bit of coughing. SpongeBob immediately noticed this and proceeded to get up and start walking over towards the kitchen. Upon reaching the kitchen area, he immediately gasped when he saw the source of the noise, which was Gary lying there on the floor, shriveling, shaking, and foaming from the mouth. You see how that could honestly have worked out a little bit easier and would have been a little bit more of a better description? That right there could have been a lot more of a help instead of, just giving off a single sentence, but that's about it. Now, another thing too as well with the paragraph itself is, well, we don't exactly really get a whole lot with this backstory. I mean, other than Gary just freaking out a bit, foaming at the mouth, and then SpongeBob taking him to the Pineapple House. I mean, this is the thing when it comes to backstories or, flashback scenes or something. They don't need to be long, but they definitely need to have a better detailed explanation as to what exactly is going on. Why exactly all this is happening. It just seems as though Gary starts foaming from the mouth, and it has really nothing to do with the food or anything, except the fact that it's spilled over until later on in the story itself. And of course, the whole storyline, the whole paragraph, the whole flashback should have just been one paragraph in and of its own self. Because after the after all of that, it immediately goes back to going back to the waiting room. And then a fish with the doctor's coat comes out and talks to SpongeBob. And then it just kind of is like really abrupt, saying, oh yeah, Gary's dead, there's rat poison or something like that, which, why would there be rat poison? I get it as a creepypasta, but there are no rats underwater. Something like a little bit more creative along the lines of maybe something like, I don't know, sea anemone kind of spray, or something a bit more creative that the SpongeBob staff would have actually more or less came up with. Something that actually would be a little bit more believable instead of like rat poison. I mean, that's a nitpick on my end, but honestly, something a little bit more creative that would fit well with the actual SpongeBob show itself would have been a lot better than just, well, he ate rat poison, that's it. I mean, that wasn't really a good explanation. And then SpongeBob yelling no, and then after that, we immediately get to the point where, Sandy and Patrick are trying to go and, comfort SpongeBob. Which, in all due sincerity, this part actually really isn't that bad. It actually has, Patrick and Sandy doing what they possibly can to try and help SpongeBob out, and the description's more or less of, well, not really a description, but the whole thing with SpongeBob actually seeing Gary, in the form of that Krabby Patty, is actually a bit of a touching moment, and really kind of helps play out with the episode. And, for the most part, it's actually really good. Up until the point, however, where it gets to the point where there's swearing. It's not, well, maybe not really so much swearing, but like the mention of the word retard, and the mentioning of the word get the hell out, And while I personally don't consider those to be curse words, I don't exactly see those fitting well within an actual SpongeBob episode. I mean, even a darker SpongeBob episode wouldn't exactly have that. I mean, it's unfortunate that they wouldn't, due to censors, but still, I mean, the whole thing with that, more or less, was, I personally think, a little bit unnecessary. There could have been something, in a replacement, I guess, that would make it a little bit more believable, but it's just not that believable at all. And then the whole thing about SpongeBob, snapping and beating the ever-living heck out of Squidward is something that, while some people might have a little bit of a problem with it being a little bit out of character for SpongeBob, I actually did enjoy that part right there. Not because I enjoy Squidward being tortured or anything, but because of the fact that he actually did something to warrant himself getting attacked in that kind of way by SpongeBob. I mean, SpongeBob literally just lost his best friend, Gary the Snail, and then not only does Squidward sit there and completely and utterly, poke fun at the fact that Gary's dead, but also sits there and, whines over the fact that why it couldn't have been SpongeBob himself or Patrick. And, the idea of it, more or less, is something that I actually can say is, a very interesting startup, and something that I would say is actually quite believable, which I have to commend the author greatly for doing, because that actually plays out well in SpongeBob's emotions and actually provide a good amount of character development within the actual storyline itself. However, that's exactly where things... But that's actually one of the better parts of this actual storyline itself. I mean, sure enough, the wordplay it was not exactly too great, especially with the whole SpongeBob finally got triggered. I hate hearing that word. I mean, I know I use it in jokes sometimes, but still, something that probably would have worked better is like SpongeBob had finally had enough of Squidward's antics and things like that. Again, a better description of the actual episode, of what's actually going on, would have actually been a lot nicer and a lot, better of a way. It's just too straightforward. There needs to be a better build-up to the whole thing, which it seems that this story kind of lacks is a proper amount of build-up. It just seems that everything just kind of happens and then it just moves on. There's not much of a proper build-up with everything, and I'm willing to use this little part of the story itself as a exception, sort of speak, but it's still just too flat out in your face. It doesn't provide any kind of proper, slow, or, well, not slow, but honest build-up to the whole thing about what SpongeBob's going through mentally and things like that. It's still an alright middle ground story, and it's still a good, okay base, but there definitely could have been a lot more to it that would have added a lot more, proper push, so to speak. Well, maybe not so much push, but something that honestly could have had a lot more, build-up, so to speak, to it. But again, we're getting to the point where, where it gets to the point where, and there's like a mentioning of realistic punch. I hate that word so much. There's no realistic punch concept. I mean, unless you've actually filmed like somebody getting punched in the face, but most of the time that's just not often used at all, so there's that, but that's a bit of a nitpick. And then, SpongeBob locking himself up in his room and things like that, which is, understandable, especially given the fact that SpongeBob snapped. And again, we're getting now to the part where it gets closer to the end of the actual story, the end of the creepypasta itself. And then, it just goes where it just immediately mentions all of that, and then 2 weeks later, and then it transitions to Sandy and Squidward. There could have been at least a little bit more character development on that one, with Squidward, realizing, what he did was wrong, and, apologizing to that to Sandy, and then Sandy ultimately helping Squidward, go and try and make it up to SpongeBob. Something that would have provided a little bit more of a better character development, or maybe just a better reasoning, perhaps, why exactly SpongeBob reacted the way that he did, and Squidward coming to the realization of it, and then wanting to go and apologize in retrospect. I mean, either of those, but I think the latter one would probably have been a lot better and, much more detailed, and again, proper character development, even in a Creepypasta Lost episode like this one. Now, the rest of it just kind of more or less goes with, the two of them trying to talk to SpongeBob, but of course not getting any remote response. And then it gets to the point where this is where I have my main complaint with this episode. When they find SpongeBob had ultimately committed not alive again. I can't say the other word because of YouTube, but yeah, committed not alive again. With hyper-realistic blood. This was going... This story, I'm not going to deny the fact, it had a couple of misses, but this one right here was the biggest missing the mark. The hyper-realistic card did not need to be made a mention of. And the whole butcher knife in the forehead kind of deal, I mean, look, here's the thing. If you were going to do something along the lines of that, I mean, it was kind of obvious that that's what was going to happen, but the way that it just went out was not believable in any form or in any way. Why would SpongeBob sit there and shove a knife into his head, for one? And why would you sit there and use hyper-realistic blood? That is not a good concept. Never should hyperrealism ever be used in a creepypasta unless it's properly incorporated. But in this story, it's not properly incorporated. It's just more or less there for the sake of just being there. Which is, unfortunate because while the story did have its own fair share of flaws, and it definitely could have used a bit more of an improvement, this one was kind of more or less the nail in the coffin that more or less solidified the fact that the story itself just doesn't exactly work as well as it should have worked. Which, again, is extremely unfortunate, as this story could have had a lot more potential to it. And then, after that, it goes more or less to the ending. Where, was this supposed to be an actual episode? There could have been a better explanation for the whole thing. I mean, at least it's an explanation. They put it back, and they never made a mention of any of that ever again, which is an okay ending. It doesn't exactly really answer a whole lot of questions, but it's an okay kind of ending. But overall, though, this story, well, I certainly can say I could tell that there was an attempt. And I'm not, denying that there wasn't an attempt. There definitely was an attempt in the story to try and make something new, as the creator of this creepypasta has made a mention of. However, the cliches and everything within the story itself, while there were very few, there were still there, and I think that it kind of more or less ruined the story a bit. Mostly with the ending, and that's something that you should never do. Even if it's something that you think is probably a good thing, always try and look back at it and fix it up if you are able to fix it up. Adding hyperrealism and like blood and things like that, it was not a necessary kind of way of going out. And I understand that, Gary is one of SpongeBob's best friends, and it's understandable that, losing a pet is a very difficult kind of way of going out. But with this entire episode, there was potential of coming up with a very beautifully made, but also a realistic depiction, albeit a dark one, that could have actually, handled this topic in a proper way. But it just more or less went from, Gary dies, SpongeBob gets upset, beats up Squidward, and then seppuku after that. Again, I can't say the other word, because, again, YouTube. But still, there could have been a lot more that could have been added that really helped, craft the whole thing. I mean, you don't have to sit there and rely on blood and guts and things like that to make your story scary. I mean, even then, creepypastas don't always have to be scary. They can be unnerving, they can be unsettling, they can be disturbing, they can be any of those kind of things. And while making a scary Lost episode itself is a little bit of a difficult challenge, I should know, I've tried, but there's still no honest reason why you shouldn't sit there and at least come up with a good plot with the whole story itself. But again, this still had potential too. It had potential. And I could definitely tell where there was some effort put into it, and I don't deny the fact that there wasn't an attempt. But even then, the story definitely needs a lot more of a proper improvement. A better, detailed storyline. The grammar needs to be fixed up a good bit, as I've made a mention of, with, more proper commas, more spacing out with the sentence, and more descriptions put into it. That way we know what's going on, and that way we can actually more or less visualize ourselves in the actual storyline itself. Because you want Lost episodes and video game pastas to more or less have a better concept to them. You want them to have a good plot with them. Even if it's something that is terrifying, it still should have a good plot to where, while it's darker, in retrospect, it still doesn't deviate too much away from the original concept of the show. But of course, like I always say with these stories, this is simply my own personal opinion, and if you disagree with it, that's perfectly fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions in regards to these creepypastas, and this is simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of the story would have to be a 4.5 out of 10. I could definitely tell that there was some aspect of, attempt to make a good story. I'm not denying that. And I'm not trying to rag on the writer here. But there were cliches at the very end of the story that ruined the story itself. The grammar, the punctuation marks could definitely have been better handled without all the periods there. There definitely needed to be a better description within what was going on within the actual storyline itself, plus a better plot arc and storyline within the concept itself. That way it would be a lot more believable and actually a lot more eye-opening and interesting. The startup of the story itself was not hook-wise, meaning it didn't exactly hook me to the story itself. And of course, it just needs a lot more polishing with the story itself. It's not a horribly made story, and there was definitely an attempt. Again, I will say that. But there needs to be proper improvements with the description and things like that in order to help make the story become, 100% beautifully well made. But again, like I always say, that's my own personal thoughts. What did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you guys like this? Did you guys not? Also, what would you have personally done to help make the story a lot better? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'm the Shadow Reader. Thanks again for watching today's episode, and if you're brand new here to this channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because I make brand new videos every single day. And of course, like always, roll the outro because I'm out. As your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will gripping horror-driven, nightmarish, gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this sunlight hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.